בבקשה.
Thank you very much. Is the sound okay? Can you hear me all right? All right, good. Thanks. Welcome again, and I'm delighted to be here with you today. I think the topic that we have before us is, as Ambassador Baker put it, quite timely, not only because of the Palestinians and their very complicated internal political dynamics in which public opinion plays, I think, a significant part, but also because all around the region we see, quite suddenly, the eruption, if one wants to put it that way, of public opinion as an important, maybe even a decisive factor in the politics of various Arab countries. The Arab Spring that we're still witnessing unfold all around the region is one in which, for the first time in recent memory, the population as a whole, the ordinary people in these countries, the so-called man in the street or the Arab street, is becoming empowered and has literally the power to overthrow or change the course of their own governments. This is new and important, and to me, I think it indicates how vital it is for us to understand, to measure, to try and deal with the issue not just of what the politicians say, but of what the people think. And so I'm going to start with a few slides, just a very few, that tell us something about not only Palestinian public opinion, but about Arab public opinion more broadly. And in this connection, I want to point to, first of all, a poll that I was fortunate to be able to do in Egypt during the revolution. I think it was the only one of its kind. And in cooperation, as you just heard, with a new polling company called Pector Middle East Polls, in which we used Arab interviewers from the region to do a telephone poll in Cairo and Alexandria at the very moment that hundreds of thousands of Egyptians were out in the streets demanding the overthrow of Mubarak. And we asked the Egyptians themselves, why is this happening? And what we got were, I think, extremely interesting, perhaps even surprising results that attracted quite a lot of very high-level attention in Washington when we presented them privately to very senior government officials, because what we found was that the main reasons for the Egyptian revolution were internal issues, and especially economic issues, not issues of Islam, of America, of Israel, of any foreign policy issues, and not even so much political issues per se, about democracy or freedom, but more about economic opportunity, inequalities, corruption, and abuses, and the ineffectiveness of Egypt's government at providing for its own people's basic needs. These were the issues, internal issues, that drove public opinion in Egypt. That is not to say, necessarily, that the Egyptian revolution will continue to focus primarily on these issues, but this is what motivated the people in Egypt to overthrow their government. And I think these results, in retrospect at least, fit very well, and I'm sorry if the type is a little small for you to be able to see, but these results fit quite well with another poll that I was able to do in Egypt a year before the revolution, in which once again, quite to the surprise of many observers, we found that when the Egyptian people were asked in an open-ended way, in other words, we are not telling them what they should think is important, we are simply asking Egyptians themselves, what's on your mind? And they can say whatever they want. We found that Egyptians were much more concerned about internal and especially, again, economic issues, including corruption, which is an issue that kind of straddles economics and politics, much more concerned about that. And what's significant about this chart, again, as in the previous case, is what's not on the chart. There is nothing on this list that Egyptians themselves came up with about foreign policy, about America, about Israel, or even about Islam. This is all about things that they care about most directly, and these are personal issues for them. Finally, I want to show you a slide before we turn to the Palestinians themselves from a different poll that I took only a few months ago in Jordan. And what I think is interesting about this slide is not only the content, but the ability of pollsters these days to ask even the most sensitive, controversial questions in Arab countries and get credible responses. And we're going to see some of these patterns repeated in the Palestinian case in just a moment. What I asked in Jordan, as I do in many countries around the region, Arab and others, is first a question about sympathy for al-Qaeda. And in Jordan, just a few months ago, we found that, as in many other countries around the region, that around 20% of the population acknowledges that, to a pollster, a complete stranger, that it does sympathize with al-Qaeda, around 20%. But in Jordan, so open is the climate these days for this kind of research that we went even a step further, and we asked Jordanians not just whether they sympathize with al-Qaeda, but what they would actually do if they knew, as the question asks, if they knew that there was someone from al-Qaeda in their own neighborhood. What would you do about it? And to our amazement, we found that 10% of the total Jordanian population, just about equally divided between Jordanians of East Bank and of Palestinian origin, around 10% of the total, actually were willing to say that they would help an al-Qaeda fugitive in their own neighborhood, rather than turn him into the authorities or turn their backs or just do something else that would be considered politically correct or a safe answer to give to an interviewer. So the general point that I'm trying to make here as we turn to the Palestinians themselves is that public opinion is important as never before, and it's also measurable as never before. People are willing to give honest answers even to the toughest questions, and that's how we can actually ascertain what people think, and then from there go on and try to figure out what it all means. The poll that I did in East Jerusalem Palestinians was, I think, significant as much as anything else, and I'm not going to repeat all the methodological descriptions on the slide here, but I think what was significant about it is that, believe it or not, after 43 years of Israeli rule over East Jerusalem, this was the first ever credible, actual poll of the Palestinians in the eastern half of the city. What does this population of almost 300,000 people actually think? No one, to my knowledge, ever before had done a credible poll to figure out what these people want, what they think about their experiences under Israeli rule, and how they see the future of their city. We did the poll in every neighborhood of East Jerusalem. Every single neighborhood of the 19 standard Arab neighborhoods of the city was polled in proportion, in exact proportion, to its share of the total population, as you can see. And we found that the resulting random sample, this was a random sample, just the same way that a scientific poll would be conducted in the United States or in Europe, or in Israel for that matter, we found that this random sample of all Palestinian neighborhoods of the city produced responses from slightly over 1,000 people who were representative, in fact, of the overall Palestinian of the population of the city by age, by education, by gender, by occupation, and also by income. Very important. And I want to just focus for a moment on one demographic, this bottom cell right over here, which shows you that 44% of the Palestinians in East Jerusalem, remember this is just East Jerusalem, not the West Bank as a whole, 44% of this population reports a monthly household income of 4,800 shekels or more, which is a lot of people, almost half the total population, who enjoy what could be considered a lower middle class or higher standard of living, much better than Palestinians in the West Bank, approximately the same overall as Arabs inside Israel, Arab citizens of Israel inside the 1967 lines, and significantly lower than that of the Israeli Jewish population. But again, in comparison to other Palestinians in the West Bank, and certainly in Gaza, the standard of living of Palestinians in East Jerusalem is reasonably good. And I want you to remember that 44% number, because we're going to see it again in just a few moments. Okay, now we come to the sort of bottom line results of the survey. And I just want to point out that these questions, although perhaps the most interesting, which is why I'm putting them up front, were asked at the end of the survey, after we had interviewed people at length about less controversial subjects, about lifestyle issues, about attitudes toward various aspects of Israeli control in Jerusalem. And we'll go through some of those issues in a moment. But at the end of the survey, once respondents, we could tell, felt reasonably comfortable answering increasingly nosy questions, we came to the bottom line issue, which is, all right, if you had to choose, would you prefer to be a citizen of Israel or a citizen of a new Palestinian state? And what we found, I think to the surprise of many people in the United States at least, perhaps not so much here, what we found was that more of the Palestinians in East Jerusalem say that they would prefer to become citizens of Israel rather than citizens of a new Palestinian state. The population, as you can see here, is divided roughly in thirds on that question, with 35% saying they would prefer to become citizens of Israel if they had to make that choice, 30% saying citizens of Palestine, and 35%, a very large percentage, saying either that they don't know which one they would prefer, or that they refuse to answer that question. And in accordance with what I believe are the best methodological practices, if people said, I don't know, or I won't answer that question, we were very strict in telling the interviewers not to press the respondents to change their minds or to give an answer if they didn't want to answer the question, or to hint in any way what the so-called right answer to that question should be, or to repeat the question, or to explain the question, or to do anything else except accept a don't know or won't answer response to this very, very controversial question. Later, we were able, after the interviews were all completed and collected and analyzed statistically, we were able to do a statistical analysis of this large group of respondents, the 35% who said they didn't know, and analyze their responses to other questions in the survey in order to make a judgment. It's not an absolutely conclusive case, but it's a good judgment about what those people are probably thinking. And based on their answers to other questions, we determined that the people who said, I don't know if I'd rather be a citizen of Palestine or a citizen of Israel, or I won't tell you, I won't answer that question, that group of people, in fact, is in the middle on their views of all the different issues that make up their life, and on issues of the concerns that they have or the hopes that they have for the future, either under Palestinian rule or under continued Israeli rule. But as a group, statistically speaking, that 35% don't know segment leans slightly in the direction of the people who say they would prefer Israeli rather than Palestinian citizenship. If you want a number on it, I will tell you that out of 50 different variables that we analyzed, the people who said, I don't know or I refuse to answer, answered more like the people who preferred Israel on 27 of those 50 variables, more like the people who said Palestine on 17 of those variables, and more like the people, and exactly in the middle on the rest of the 50 variables that we measured after the survey was completed. So as I say, the don't know group really was in between, but they leaned slightly, I would say, toward preferring Israeli rather than Palestinian citizenship. Now, when we asked people not about themselves, and this is a sort of a trick question that pollsters, often use when they're asking about very controversial issues. They can ask people not only what do you think, but in order to kind of make it a little safer to answer, we can ask people, what do you think your neighbors think? What do people like you think about this issue? And when we asked that question, we found that actually the results changed only a very little bit. Slightly more, 39% in this case, said they thought most of their neighbors would prefer Israeli to Palestinian citizenship. But that's not a whole lot more than the 35% who said that of themselves. And so this gives us an indication that the answers to this question are probably honest. In other words, when people say this roughly the same thing about what they think and what they think their neighbors think, that's usually an indication in polling practice that people are telling you candidly what their real opinions are. And then we went another step further, and we asked people an even harder question, which is not only would you rather be an Israeli or a Palestinian citizen if you had to make that choice, but would you actually do something about it, and do something really pretty difficult, which is to move, get up and move in order to be a citizen of whichever side you preferred. If, again, in case that choice became a necessity as part of some peace settlement or as part of some division of the city between Palestinian and Israeli rule. And we found that when we asked people whether they would move into Palestine, right, most of them said no. But when we asked people, these Palestinians in East Jerusalem, whether they would actually move in order to become a citizen of Israel if their existing neighborhood came under Palestinian rule, I think this is perhaps the most surprising, hard data point that we found in this survey. Fully 40% of the Palestinians in East Jerusalem said that they would actually probably or definitely move in order to live under Israeli rather than Palestinian rule if they had to make that choice. Well, that rather startling to me result provokes the obvious question, why? Why do these people feel that way? They're Palestinians, after all. Why would so many of them rather become Israeli rather than Palestinian citizens and even move to Israel in order to make that choice possible? And that's why we have lots and lots of data, literally thousands of pages of printout of very detailed data about how Palestinians in East Jerusalem see their situation. And so we ask them in a completely open-ended way about their attitudes toward different aspects of their daily lives, and their attitudes toward Israel and toward the Palestinian Authority and toward their neighbors and so on and so on. And we found, I think, a few interesting and surprising things, and I'm going to try to go through this very quickly so that we'll have more time for discussion in just a few moments. First, one interesting question was to ask people how satisfied or dissatisfied they are with their standard of living. And remember I told you a few moments ago to keep in mind that 44% figure of Palestinians with an average household income of 4,800 shekels or more. Well, it turns out that exactly 44%, and I think this is not a coincidence, of the Palestinians in the city say that they are very or at least somewhat satisfied with their standard of living. Almost half. It's a very high percentage compared to other populations in the Arab world that I've studied. Almost half of the population says that they're satisfied with their standard of living. And then we asked people about a whole long list of things, and we found that many of these Palestinians are generally pretty satisfied with a lot of aspects, a lot of important issues in their daily lives. And you can see a long list of things here: education, access to a nearby place of worship, basic services, electricity and water, health care. These are the issues that most Palestinians are most satisfied about. Not all of them. Again, I want to point out that there's a significant percentage that have a kind of a neutral view or even a negative view of these issues. But in every single case, the majority are satisfied with all of these aspects of their life. And of course, to be fair, we also asked about what issues Palestinians in East Jerusalem are dissatisfied about. And here's the list of the top issues, as reported by the Palestinians themselves. And what you can see here is building permits is number one. And again, to those of you who follow the news about the city, this is probably not terribly surprising. It doesn't actually affect all that many people directly, but people know about it and care about it and are dissatisfied with that and are willing to say that quite openly. And then comes taxes. Well, everybody hates taxes, so again, it's not a big surprise that so many Palestinians are dissatisfied with how much real estate or income tax they have to pay. But what's actually more interesting, I think, here is that these issues, which are next on the list of most dissatisfied responses, it actually turns out that less than half of the Palestinians in East Jerusalem are dissatisfied with their personal interactions with Jews in the city, with their ability to obtain travel documents, with their personal interactions with municipal officials, or with disability benefits. So while there is some dissatisfaction on those issues, it is less than half of the Palestinians who report that they are dissatisfied. Now, we asked, and again, in an effort to be absolutely neutral and fair about soliciting honest opinions even on controversial subjects, we asked Palestinians whether they feel that there's discrimination against them. And what we found, and I have to say this is something that municipal officials are going to be interested to hear about, I think, when we meet with them on this poll later today, we found that 56%, a majority of Palestinians in East Jerusalem, did report that they do feel that there is a great deal or a fair amount of discrimination against them by the municipality itself. In other words, official, not social discrimination, but official discrimination against them. So this is a kind of a balance, if you like, or a counterpoint to the relatively high levels of satisfaction that I reported on just a moment ago. Yes, they're reasonably satisfied with a lot of things, but that doesn't mean that they feel, on the whole, that they're being treated equally. On the whole, they don't feel that they're being equally treated. Now, in order to find out a little bit more about what the problems are, we asked people in great detail about specific issues. And here we found, and this is not an open-ended question, this is a long list of issues that we presented to Palestinians and asked them, how big a problem is this for you? And we found that highest on the list were physical barriers to movement. Then comes crime, which is not an issue of any Israeli policies, just a sort of general social problem that anybody could have anywhere. And lower on the list, interestingly enough, were problems that are more often in the news, I think, in a more sensational way, but actually fewer Palestinians care as much about, which is issues of intimidation from settlers or from Israeli officials or security authorities, or corruption or intimidation or threats by other Palestinians, which is not an insignificant concern that these people have. Here you can see it lower on the list, but still around not quite half of the Palestinians in East Jerusalem report that corruption or malfeasance by the Palestinian Authority, which, by the way, is not supposed to have officially any actual role in East Jerusalem, but almost half of the Palestinians in the city report that corruption by PA officials is a big problem, or at least a moderate problem for them personally. That's a very interesting and, in some respects, troubling statistic, I think, that comes out. In order to understand better, again, how these people actually interact with either Israelis or with other Palestinians, we asked about travel patterns. And to my surprise, we found that because of their special status and their blue cards, which enable them to travel into the West Bank and back into Jerusalem, or into Israel and back into Jerusalem, into other parts of Israel and back into Jerusalem, and even outside of Israel and back in. Because of their special status, this population, quite unlike, I think, West Bank or Gaza Palestinians, is very mobile and not isolated at all, either from Palestinians or from Israelis. It's really a strikingly high incidence of travel to West Jerusalem, to other areas of Israel, to the West Bank, and also quite a high level of interaction, personal interaction, with Jewish citizens of Israel, not just with other Palestinians. So this is a population, because of, again, their special status, their work patterns, often on the western side of the city, their education, often in Israeli institutions, and so on. This is a population that actually has a lot of exposure, both to the West Bank and to Israel, and both to other Palestinians and to Israelis. And I think partly for that reason, we found, when we asked people about different identities, that the identity of being a blue card holder, in other words, their special status as East Jerusalem residents, not citizens of Israel, but with a lot of the privileges and benefits of work and travel and social benefits and so on. That identity as a blue card holder, incredibly, is almost as important to these people as their identity as a Palestinian or even as a Muslim. It's very important to these people that they have that special status. And that helps to explain, of course, as you can probably guess by now, that helps to explain why such a high percentage of them, if faced with the choice, would choose to be citizens of Israel and preserve that some special status and their access to education and employment and travel and social benefits, rather than give up those benefits and privileges in return for Palestinian citizenship. Now here comes a question that I think is particularly timely in view of the news just yesterday of the Hamas-Fatah so-called unity agreement. Remember that this is not the Palestinian population as a whole. It's not the West Bank, it's not Gaza, it's just East Jerusalem. But compared to the importance of their identity as a Muslim or a Palestinian or a blue card holder, sympathy for Fatah or for Hamas is very low in comparative terms. And you can see from this chart that only 30% or maybe just a little bit more sympathize either with Fatah or with Hamas or with the Islamic movement inside the Green Line, with the Israeli Arab Islamic movement. So this is a population whose political sympathies are not that strong or well defined in comparison with their focus on their own personal identities, either religious, national, or economic, right, and social. Politics is not a major preoccupation for this population. Finally, after doing all of this sort of background questioning and trying to understand for ourselves why people might end up with some political preference or other, we ask the Palestinians directly. Just if you want to know why somebody thinks something, just ask them, okay? You don't have to necessarily do a lot of fancy statistical analysis. Just ask them, why? Why do you want to be a Palestinian citizen or an Israeli citizen? And we asked this question, and this is crucial, in a completely open-ended way. We did not suggest what the answers should be. We didn't even provide a list of alternatives. We just said, why? You tell me. What's on your mind? And we found, not surprisingly, I think by now, in view of all the data I've already presented, we found that for most Palestinians who said they wanted to be citizens of Israel, if they had to make that choice, that 35% or so of this population, it's practical issues that dominate. And the practical issues are all the ones we already saw in the other charts. Freedom of movement, higher income, health insurance, job opportunities, prosperity, more shops. And then a little bit later and much lower down the list come issues of politics or culture or discipline, as these people or the pollsters coded the responses, meaning something like social order, not chaos and anarchy, kind of law and order. But much, much higher on the list were very practical concerns. And the contrast couldn't be clearer if we look now at the Palestinians who said they would rather be citizens of Palestine. A smaller group, 30% of the population. For these people, practical issues were not very important, as you can see. Issues of nationalism and identity and religion and getting rid of discrimination. Those were the issues that dominated the attitudes of the Palestinians, the minority of Palestinians, but still a significant chunk of this population, who said, no, I would give up my freedom of movement, my access to health care and Israeli jobs and Israeli standard of living and so on, in order to become a citizen, in order to follow my own national identity and become a citizen of a Palestinian state, not of Israel. And then we went another step further, and I'm almost at the end here, of asking people what they would be concerned about and what benefits they foresaw for themselves from either Palestinian or Israeli citizenship. And you can see here that people were concerned if they became a citizen of Palestine, and now we're talking to the entire sample, the total sample, no matter what their preference was. This population had a lot of significant concerns about losing employment in Israel, losing free movement in Israel, etc., losing Israeli health care, reduction in city services, also about an increase in corruption, which is interesting, and most of all about the possibility of losing access to the Old City and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And it turns out, interestingly and ironically, that is also highest on the list. Losing access to the Old City and the Al-Aqsa Mosque is highest on the list of concerns when Palestinians were asked, what would you be concerned about if you became a citizen of Israel? In other words, these people don't know, nobody does, and these people least of all, where the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Old City are going to end up, under whose control, if the city is actually divided or whatever arrangement is reached for the future of Jerusalem. And so whether they become Palestinian citizens or Israeli citizens, they're worried either way about losing that access. That's quite important to them. And what you can see here, and here I'm coming back to the first slides I presented, is that many of the concerns that these people have are very similar to the top concerns that are being expressed all over the region in public opinion and in the Arab uprisings that we're now witnessing. From Egypt to Tunisia to Yemen and on and on and on. People are concerned, most of all, these are the highest ones on the list, about economic opportunities, about corruption, and about freedoms, about the freedom to write and speak freely. And it's very interesting to me that these Palestinians, 3/4 of them, are at least a little concerned, and more than half are more than a little concerned that they would lose their ability to write and speak freely if they became citizens of a Palestinian state, rather than remaining under Israeli control. Then we also asked people, again, to be fair, not just what they were worried about, but also what benefits they expected, what good things they could see coming from becoming a citizen of a Palestinian state. And you can see that the list is mostly, and rather predictably, I think, in this case, about identity issues and access to fellow Palestinians or other Arabs. And we did the same for Israel. If you became part of Israel, what would you be concerned about? And again, a lot of concerns, starting with, as I said, losing access to the Old City and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, but also, I think, quite understandable concerns about discrimination in Israel against Arabs, about losing access to other parts of Palestine as they see it, and also, interestingly enough, fairly high on the list, moral misconduct of your children. This is something that this population, although they can see a lot of practical benefits from interaction with Israel, they also see some social problems coming from Israeli society. And they're, generally speaking, quite a religious and conservative group of people, educated and young as they may be, on the whole. And so a fairly high proportion of the population are concerned about what they would see as the kind of lax moral standards or, let's say, more progressive atmosphere in Israeli society compared to their ideal of a Muslim society and culture. But one of the most interesting issues that Palestinians raised is this one, and it came as a surprise, to me at least, to see that 60% of the Palestinians in East Jerusalem say, yeah, sure, we'd be concerned, or we're interested in Israeli healthcare and utilities and social benefits and jobs and all of those things, but we also want access to the beach. 60% of the Palestinian population, and remember, this is a very young population on the whole, and they are free to travel in Israel, and we saw before that they do travel in Israel quite a lot, much more, I think, than many of us would have expected. And so access to the beach now becomes a factor for these people in relatively high on the list of issues that they think about when they consider their future. All right, now I have just 3 more slides about timely issues. Before we get to a settlement that might partition Jerusalem or come up with some arrangement for its future or decide on any of these theoretical citizenship questions, we have to face the facts that today the peace process is going nowhere. And that even if the peace process does produce an agreement, that will not necessarily be more than a piece of paper. That will not necessarily be the end of conflict. And so we ask these Palestinians a question that very few pollsters ever ask anybody, which is, if there is an agreement, will the conflict continue anyway? What do you think? And interestingly, I think, and somewhat scarily, a very significant proportion of the population said that they thought that, yes, the armed struggle against Israel would continue even after a peace agreement. Almost half, or 41% to be precise, of this population thought that armed conflict probably or definitely would continue even after a peace agreement. And remember, these are among, in other respects, the most moderate, even some could say pro-Israeli population of all the Palestinians. And yet they think that even an agreement would not necessarily end the conflict. And then we asked them a little bit more specifically, how about your own neighborhood? How do you think people in your own neighborhood would react to an agreement? Would they stop the struggle or would they continue it? And once again, confirming, I think, the data from the previous slide, we see that a considerable proportion of this population, almost a third, 31% say that around half or more of people in their own neighborhood would support the continuation of armed struggle against Israel even after a peace agreement. If the negotiations collapse, another, I think, unfortunately more likely scenario, if the negotiations collapse, how likely is a new intifada in East Jerusalem? Mixed views on this. Only 27% say very likely, but an additional 37%, in other words, putting those two figures together, almost two-thirds of East Jerusalem Palestinians say that a new intifada is at least somewhat likely if peace negotiations completely collapse. And now, another, perhaps even more likely scenario, especially in view of what seems today, literally today, to be the Palestinian preference for a unilateral approach to the peace process. Looking ahead, if the Palestinians go ahead with their declared strategy for September, then what? And here, I think, there is good reason for the Palestinian Authority to think harder about where it's really going and what the effect on its own population is likely to be. Because only a third of the Palestinians, at least in East Jerusalem, only a third, a minority, say that a unilateral Palestinian independence, even one backed by the United Nations, would have a positive effect on their own lives. Two-thirds, in other words, say that such a unilateral step would be no more than an empty declaration and would not have a positive effect on their own lives. And if the Palestinians proceed down this path, as they seem intent on doing, it seems to me to be a possible recipe for trouble with their own population, not just with Israel or the international community, because of the expectations that will be raised and the almost, as this slide suggests, the almost inevitable disappointment that is likely to follow. So there is a possibility, in my view, of an intifada, not only against Israel, but against the Palestinian Authority itself, along the lines of the uprisings that we have seen in some of the other parts of the Arab region in the last few months. That concludes my presentation, and I'd be very happy, thank you for your patience and interest, I'd be very happy to take whatever questions or comments you might have. Thank you.
Yes, please.
Could you tell how many people you asked in Alexandria, in Cairo, Jordan, and in the eastern part?
Sure. Yeah. In Alexandria and Cairo, we asked 250 people in each city, which gives, because this was a true random sample, that gives you, for the total sample of 500, gives you a margin of error of about 5%. And in Jordan, it was a true probability sample, but national, the whole country, of 1,000 people. So that gives you a sampling margin of error of about 3%, and a little over 3%. So these are very, very solid surveys, I think, conforming to the most rigorous international standards, like surveys that would be done anywhere.
And Eastern Jerusalem?
In East Jerusalem, the total sample was 1,039, and which, because the overall population is much smaller, the margin of error is going to be slightly smaller, so the margin of error is going to be about 2.9%, less than 3%. And again, the Jerusalem sample covered the entire city, every single neighborhood, a true random sample. And in this case, it was not a phone poll. These were face-to-face interviews. Right.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Jean-Michel, do you think any of the Palestinian Authority or Arab countries would take your poll
Yeah.
into effect in 2000?
Yes, I do. And it's a very good question. Thank you. The Palestinian Authority is aware of these results. We presented them previously for the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington and again in New York. And there were Palestinian activists present who I know they're not officials, but they're in very, very close contact with the most senior levels of the PA. And they were very interested and very receptive in the sense of feeling that they needed to know more about this and that this could be useful in making the PA more aware that, as one of these Palestinians put it, and I'm not allowed to quote him by name, but he said that we have a problem with this population, that they're not on our side. Let me just, if I may, say something about other Arab governments. Arab governments are, and by the way, we also presented these results to a Palestinian audience just yesterday in East Jerusalem, and found again that they are not only very interested, but also, I think, very convinced that these are valid findings and that they conform to their own experiences and perceptions of people around them here in the city, and that there's a lot of food for thought here about where they need to go. Now, they might reach very different political conclusions, but taking this into account, I think, is something that these days is just a necessity. If you're a politician and you don't take public opinion into account, you're going to get into big trouble. That much is pretty clear these days. Other Arab countries do pay attention to polls sometimes, increasingly so, I think. But, of course, in the more repressive the country, like in Syria, for example, the harder it is to do polls and the less the government seems to care about them. But in a country like Jordan, and I was talking to someone here about that earlier, the Jordanian government, the royal court, actually has its own pollster. It actually has a royal pollster. Can you imagine? A king with a pollster. It sounds like almost an oxymoron, but they do care about public opinion in their country, and they measure it. That doesn't mean that they always, or even often, try to accommodate public opinion on the toughest issues, but they're interested to find out about it, and it does factor into their calculations. And I found that even in Saudi Arabia, where polling is very difficult, but I am able to do it, that the Saudi government, I think, I can only surmise from a distance, but the Saudi government is interested in results like this and sometimes acts on it. And I'll give you an example. I did a poll in Saudi Arabia in November of 2009, and I found that, as in every other country where I've been polling, people's top concerns were about the economy, even though it's supposedly a rich country, and about corruption, not about foreign policy, Islam, democracy, no. The economy and corruption, that's what Saudis cared the most about. And that's something that I think the royal family in Saudi Arabia does take into account when they're trying to head off a popular uprising. The first thing they do is throw hundreds of billions of dollars at the population because they can afford to do that, and it works so far. And I also found that when you ask the Saudis, what do you think about various television stations that are broadcasting in Arabic to you, Al Jazeera got, high marks, and El Manar, the Hezbollah station, got very low marks, which was interesting and encouraging. But the lowest marks of all, most negative ratings, were for Al Alam, which is Iranian television broadcasting in Arabic. And it's, terrible propaganda, and I know because I'm often a guest on El Alam speaking in Arabic and hoping maybe that there are a few people out there who pay attention. And so after this, 2 weeks after this poll came out, and I don't think this was a coincidence, the Saudi government took El Alam off the air. they revoked its satellite transmission privileges on Arabsat, which is how it was getting into Saudi Arabia. So I think that, at least to some extent, even in non-democratic regimes, the governments are paying attention to this kind of data, and they should.
Yes, please.
I'd like to ask you about geographical and social status
Sure.
breakdown.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Well,
Well, I have. I don't think we have time to go into as much detail as I have on it. I have, 200 pages of numbers. But I will say this just very briefly. It's a great question. Thank you for that. That we found that there is not a whole lot of difference by most demographic categories on most of these questions. In other words, young and old, rich and poor, better educated and less educated, they're not that different in this population, at least. Now, the younger segment of the population is slightly more attuned to the privileges and benefits that they perceive from Israeli rule, and slightly more inclined to say that they would prefer Israeli citizenship, but not by a whole lot. Geographically, there are some very interesting differences by neighborhood. And some neighborhoods, some individual neighborhoods are more radical, so to speak, and others more moderate. For example, the neighborhood that is the most inclined to say that they would prefer Israeli citizenship is Kafar Aqab. And do you know why? Because Kafar Aqab is on the wrong side of the wall. And so it's the one Arab neighborhood in Jerusalem that's on the eastern side of the wall. And so even though they have Jerusalem identity cards, it's much harder for them to enjoy all these privileges that so many of these Palestinians care about, especially freedom of movement, but other things too. It's harder to get a job if you're on the, all that stuff. Go to a good school, and so they would more than any other neighborhood say, I'm enough of this. I want to just do it and become an Israeli citizen and be on the right side. But it's not a majority, even in Kafar Aqab. It's just more than the average of 35%. And in Shuafat, or Shuafat refugee camp, where attitudes are, by comparison, the least moderate, even there, you do not get a majority of that neighborhood saying that they would rather be Palestinian citizens. Even in Shuafat refugee camp, it's an incredible result, and I think very counterintuitive. And again, that's a sign that despite these people don't live well, and they do face discrimination and harassment and so on. But even so, they have mixed feelings about whether it would be better to stay the way they are, or maybe become Israeli citizens and move out of that deprivation, or to become citizens of Palestine.
May I just ask
Sure.
a question?
Yeah.
In Beit Hanina, I don't
Beit
know,
Hanina, right. Also very moderate.
it's a relatively
Right.
well-off
That's right.
Christian
Yes.
Catholic community.
Okay. Beit Hanina is very interesting for a lot of reasons, including the fact that, as I'm told, that Salam Fayyad has a house there, and so do other senior PA officials.
Yeah.
The Christian community of the city is, in our sample, only 7% of the total, and I think that is reflective of the population as a whole, almost exactly. It's a very small minority by now, and for that reason, there are not enough of them to do statistically valid tests or conclusions. They do appear. Again, from a sample of 77 or so, it's hard to draw firm conclusions, but they do appear to be slightly more inclined to say they would prefer Israeli rather than Palestinian citizenship, but not by a huge factor, not so much. But Beit Hanina is interesting because it is among the neighborhoods where you have a higher than average percentage of residents saying they would rather be Israeli
Israeli.
than Palestinian citizens. Yeah.
Mr. Bellman.
As interesting as these findings are,
Yeah.
I find it very difficult to believe that it will have any
Right.
effect on the disposition of Jerusalem.
Yeah. So do I. Yeah. but I agree with you.
It's only
Yeah.
10% of the entire Palestinian population.
Correct. Right.
And the leaders
Yeah.
are not responsive. They have an agenda.
Right.
So the
Right.
only way it would make a difference
Yeah.
if Israel were to insist on the city remaining
Right.
unified,
Right.
at least the people wouldn't be fighting.
That's right. I agree. I agree. However, I think that whether it will have an effect or whether it should have an effect, those are not the same things. And in my opinion, these findings should have an effect, at least in refining the discussion of Jerusalem, so that I would put it this way, and I think this is also important, you know, from an American government or a broader international perspective. For people who tend to assume that a fair and reasonable and practical solution for the Jerusalem issue is for the Arab neighborhoods to become part of Palestine and the Jewish neighborhoods to become part of Israel. For people who assume that, which means most people in the world, I think, these findings suggest that that is somewhat problematic from the point of view of the people who actually live in East Jerusalem. And therefore, as if things weren't complicated enough already, therefore there's another factor that probably needs to be taken into account, or we're going to end up, even in the best case scenario, with a very disgruntled population of Palestinians who will be forced under that arrangement to come under Palestinian rule when they don't want that. And in many cases, again, not all of them, but a significant, very significant chunk, a plurality actually, of the population. And so what, at a minimum, my own suggestion, and you know, it's just a personal opinion and it's not in the data, here I'm trying to answer your question with my own idea about it, is that at a minimum, people should keep in mind the possibility of some arrangement that responds to people's personal needs and aspirations, not just to their collective identity or to their political leadership. So maybe, for example, maybe some voluntary movement back and forth or special status even after a peace agreement or something like that might be worthy of consideration. It's going to take a lot of creative thought to factor this new data into what's already a very difficult issue. Yeah.
Joel.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
I have one point and two small questions.
Sure.
As far as it should not be surprising that authoritarian regimes keep track of public opinion. There were always, under the Nazi regime, public opinion reports,
Right.
and there was a very
Right,
famous
yes.
historian by the name of Eberhard
Yeah.
Jacob,
Yeah.
who followed them and published on them.
Right. Yeah.
And
I've seen some of that. Yeah.
We're
Right.
very much aware
Right.
of how people
Absolutely.
really
Yeah.
felt.
Right.
Now,
Yeah.
two questions. I saw a newspaper report sometime about an Arab in East Jerusalem near the Mount of Olives Cemetery. And he ran a grocery store, and on the wall was a picture of Saddam Hussein. And he said, of course, he wanted to be in Israel
Uh-huh.
if there were a separation. And the reason was that he wanted to be under the Israeli legal system.
Okay.
And I wondered if that fit in. And just intuitively, could you tell us a word about al-Fahim, you know?
Sure. Yeah.
Those are the short questions.
Okay. All right. The legal system. I have to say that it doesn't come up very much in the spontaneous responses that Palestinians give when you ask either about their biggest concerns or their highest hopes or anything, you know, what they're satisfied or dissatisfied about. That, I mean, some of the issues that are sort of on the edges of legal do come up, like crime as a problem that many people feel, or issues of unequal treatment by Israeli municipal authorities. But the legal system per se doesn't seem to be a major preoccupation, I would say. And, you know, you'd have to do more research to find out why that is, and I can imagine some plausible reasons for it, but I don't have the data, so I'll leave it at that. Now, on the question of al-Fahm, okay, just as a word of background, I'm sure most of you know that al-Fahm is one of the largest Israeli Arab cities. In other words, these are people who are Arabs, Palestinians, but Israeli citizens inside the 1967 lines, and they have their own very interesting patterns of public opinion, which require really separate surveys. And people, there are Israeli and Israeli Arab and other academics and experts and pollsters who are studying that population. And they tend to have mixed identities, increasingly over the years identifying themselves more as Palestinians than as Israelis, but at the same time a very large majority wants to remain Israeli citizens, and they also want that to take on a different meaning, in the sense that they want, as a group, again collectively, they want the nature of Israel to be different, to be more equal, to be less Jewish, to be more binational, if you like, almost. But clearly, that's a population that, in some ways, is similar to the Palestinians in East Jerusalem, because while they have a strong Palestinian identity, and they perceive and resent discrimination against them, they do recognize and appreciate the benefits that they enjoy from being under Israeli rule, either as citizens or as in the special status that Palestinians in East Jerusalem have, and they want to keep those benefits, and they do not want to be, moved out or kind of have the border drawn around them in a way that would put them under Arab rather than Israeli rule.
Let me just add here that when we were preparing for negotiations with the Palestinians on the issue of Jerusalem, this was the major factor that was stressed by many East Jerusalem Arabs who are either Israeli citizens or permanent residents, who said that they wouldn't in any event want to give up their social security and health benefits.
Right. Well, that's right.
Yeah. And this is a major factor. Right. Last question, please.
Yeah.
You said that in most of the Arab countries and also in Israel, like, foreign policy wasn't a major issue.
Absolutely right.
But
yeah.
To the degree that it was,
Mm-hmm.
I just asked, what
Sure.
were people's feelings about the U.S. and about Iran?
Well, boy, that's a great question, but that requires a whole nother seminar. But I'll try in a sentence or two to summarize what I know. It varies a lot over time and by country, but in general, the image of the United States in Arab public opinion was terrible under President Bush. It had a kind of a spike in a positive direction, a honeymoon, if you like, when President Obama first came into office, and then, according to most polls in most places, has dropped back significantly, so that only somewhere usually in the 20%, 30% range have a favorable image of the United States or of President Obama these days. However, in Egypt, in this immediate revolutionary period, there isn't a whole lot of data, but what there is kind of conflicting and mixed, and it seems to be very variable. And I would just say that in my poll of Egypt, the United States and Obama got mixed reviews, almost evenly split between good, bad, don't know, in thirds, roughly. A subsequent one poll that I saw subsequently from Egypt shows that it's a little worse than that, according to this poll. It's like a slight plurality. You have a negative view of American policy these days. So I'd say basically mixed toward the United States. Not as bad as a few years ago. Not as good as 2009. Something that we're not happy about, but kind of comfortable with. We're getting not terrible reviews in the region. On Iran, really, really interesting that most Arab publics, according to my polls, and most of the other good ones that I know about, although mine are the best, right? But most of the other, and the bad ones disagree with this, but I don't believe them. Most Arabs in most countries that are polled really don't like Iran, and they're really afraid of Iran. And that holds true for Egypt, for Jordan, for everybody but the Shiites in Lebanon, for Saudi Arabia, definitely. The Saudi public, I'm not talking about the governments here, the Saudi public definitely really doesn't like Iran. And in many of these countries, you get, as a result, you get 40% or more supporting sanctions against Iran. That's a very high percentage that would support international pressure against a fellow Muslim country, after all, or against any country, after all. And in Saudi Arabia, you even got, when I did this poll, and I was really stunned by these numbers. I got a third of the Saudi public saying that they wanted the United States to bomb Iran's nuclear facilities. A third of the Saudi public.
What about the Saudi Air Force?
No. Not asked. But we did ask about the Israelis bombing Iran, and we got 25% support for that in Saudi Arabia. Not in Egypt. In Egypt, it was much lower. So that's to me, this is very important and encouraging in the sense that while the United States is often faulted for all kinds of things by the media and by some segments of the public in these countries, the American image is actually not that bad these days. Not great, but it's not that bad. And Iran it really has few friends in the region, even among the ordinary people. Not talking about the elites or the governments here, and that's very good to know. So, on the other hand, the Palestinians, by the way, the Palestinians have a terrible opinion of the United States and are more favorable toward Iran than most other Arabs, and that's partly, I think, a result of their own special circumstances and their feeling that they've been kind of abandoned or something like that, and that they need whatever friends they can get, even not very nice friends. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Pollock.
My great pleasure. Thank you all for your attention and consideration. Appreciate it. Yeah.